So first of all, welcome everybody to the annual Martin Doody Memorial Lecture. It's been, for very obvious reasons, a year like no other, and I'm especially glad you've taken the time to join the Discovery programme for this event. It's the first time we've held the lecture online, and while we miss out on that opportunity to meet up with people and have the chat in person, we've also had the opportunity to open the doors much wider to an audience that might not have been able to come otherwise. We've even had to extend our Zoom license to accommodate the numbers of people who have been interested in this, so that's really great, a good challenge. My name's John O'Keefe, and I've just taken up the post of Chief Executive Officer with the Discovery Programme this week. And I'm very privileged to be introducing the lecture tonight. And as part of my duties, I'll say a little bit about housekeeping guidelines for the presentation in just a wee moment. Now, in terms of the event, as many of you will know, it's named in memory of the late Martin Doody, a graduate of Archaeology from the University College Cork. And Martin led one of the first major projects undertaken by the Discovery Programme. He was the project director of the Discovery Programme's Ballyhura project from 1992 to 2008 as the Discovery Programme's monograph number 7. Now, I knew of Martin from his published work, but having spoken to people who knew him personally, I've been left with the deep impression of a scholar who was thorough in his work, thorough in the work that he conducted, and a gentle, courteous, and courageous, affable person. He left a legacy for archaeology and archaeologists, and also a legacy for wider society through his involvement with the Irish Kidney Association. Following Martin's early death in July of 2015, the Discovery Programme inaugurated the Martin Doody Memorial Lecture, and the first lecture was given by Professor William O'Brien back on the 7th of December 2015. There's many legacies of the Ballyhura project, or Ballyhura Hills project, not least of all the demonstration of integrated approaches to the study of the historic landscape and its archaeology can deliver deeper, insightful, and accessible information about the past. It allows for the telling and the retelling of our understanding of the past, and it creates that space for us to learn new things and to reevaluate the old things that we thought we knew before. And in that context, it's very fitting that I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Alison Sheridan to present her talk to you this evening. Now, Dr. Alison Sheridan will be known to many of you. She recently retired, although she tells me she's just as busy as before, as Principal Archaeologist and Research Curator in the National Museum in Scotland, having worked there since 1987. She obtained a doctorate from the University of Cambridge, and her research has been focusing on the Scottish Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Early Bronze Age. In that wider European context, specialising in pottery, stone axes, and jewellery of jet, faience, and gold. Now, Dr. Sheridan has had a long and keen interest in the archaeology of Ireland. Many moons ago, I first met her when she was looking at material from the late Derek Simpson's excavations of Ballygally in County Antrim. Of Scotland, and she became a fellow of the British Academy in 2019. And this year, she was elected Current Archaeologist of the Year 2020. Currently, Alison is a research associate with the Department of Scottish History and Archaeology in National Museums. Now, the Boyne to Brodgar initiative, to borrow the words of Alison Sheridan and her own Professor Gabriel Cooney, was a brainchild of the late Professor Magdalena Midgley and developed into a major project around about the understanding, which includes preserving, presenting, and raising awareness of Neolithic monuments and the people who built and used them in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. It's a project that's set within an overall research framework presented thematically, and it looks at the sites and their settings, their origins and their subsequent histories, and ultimately a closer understanding of the people that built and interacted with the monuments of those areas and how those people interacted with each other. This promises to be a most interesting presentation by Dr. Sheridan, and I'd be delighted if you'd make use of the question and answer facility over the course of the presentation. And at the end, we'll have a chance to gather up those questions and see where the discussion takes us. Just a few house rules for the evening. The settings on Zoom, as we have them at the moment, should mean that only the presenter's voice would be normally heard. But I would be grateful if you just check to make sure your microphone is set onto mute. We've had a good internet connection here so far, but if for whatever reason the internet connection goes down, we'll try to re-establish our contact as quickly as possible. And if it does happen, you might need to click onto the link again, but fingers crossed that won't happen. So for asking questions, if you wave your cursor about on your screen, you'll see a little toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window and a question and answers box. So if you pop your question in there, and we'll do our best to present them, as I say, at the end. If you'd include your name with your question, and we'll put the questions across to Dr. Sheridan, our YouTube channel. And so you'll be wondering maybe why I'm reading out some of the questions, but whenever this goes up onto the YouTube channel, anybody that's viewing wouldn't have the ability to see the questions box beforehand. So that's why I'm maybe asking the questions you'll see on screen. And we'll be planning another series of seminars for the research frameworks for archaeology in Ireland in the new year. So we'll say a little bit more about that at the end. So while the internet connection is still good, I have the great pleasure of passing over a command and control of the screen to Dr. Alison Sheridan.
Thank you very, very much for that kind introduction, John. And I hope you can all hear me okay. So it's a great honour to have been invited to present this year's Martin Doody Memorial Lecture, remembering such a fine, kind and gentle archaeologist. I have fond, if now somewhat distant memories of Martin from when we met at various conferences way back in the 1970s and 80s. And it's an honour not only to be marking Martin's memory, but also because I should be presenting on behalf of a large number of distinguished archaeologists and organisations in Ireland, Scotland and the Isle of Man, who make up the Boyne to Brodgar family. What I propose to do in this lecture is to explain what the Boyne to Brodgar initiative is and what it sets out to achieve. I'll then explain how the initiative came about. We'll outline the ways in which the Neolithics of Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man interdigitate, as mentioned in my title, and I'll mention the main research questions as identified in the Boyne to Brodgar research framework that we created. I'll then showcase some of the thrilling recent and current research that's being done under the Boyne to Brodgar umbrella, and we'll end by looking forward to our plans and hopes for the future. So without more ado, let's go back to the beginning. What is Boyne to Brodgar? Well, as an organisation, it's a loose affiliation of archaeologists and heritage managers from Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man and Germany, who have come together in the spirit of international friendship and collaboration to explore, celebrate, promote and publicise Neolithic monuments and the people who built and used them in Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man. You can see the names of the main participants here. It's currently chaired by Professor Jane Downes of the Archaeological Institute of the University of Highlands and Islands in Orkney. Boyne to Brodgar came into being in 2012 and currently exists as an umbrella initiative assisting and facilitating research and other projects relating to the Neolithic of these areas. At present, Boyne to Brodgar has no funds that it can disperse, but it can lend its support to grant applications and it can act as a strong and we hope influential advocate. And the aim is eventually to secure funding from various sources. Specifically, Boyne to Brodgar has three main objectives. Firstly, improve our understanding of these monuments, of the people who built and used them, and of the connections between these people in Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man by fostering and promoting research. And to this end, I and Gabriel Cooney published a Boyne to Brodgar research framework in the 2014 volume of the Journal of Irish Archaeology, setting out what we feel are the key outstanding research questions concerning the Neolithic in these areas. This complements and articulates with other research frameworks, including SCARF, Scotland's Archaeological Research Framework, plus the various regional research frameworks for Scotland that have led on from this. Also, through the Boyne World Heritage Site Research Framework that you'll have heard about in Jessica Smith's recent lecture. Also, the Research Agenda and Management Plan for the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. And we hope that it will also articulate with the research framework for archaeology in Ireland that I understand is being developed just now. The second objective is to assist policymakers and other heritage professionals to formulate policies and strategies regarding the investigation, preservation and public presentation of these monuments, and in particular to develop a joined up and sustainable heritage tourism trails analogous to the wildly successful Wild Atlantic Way that encourage visitors to see the big picture by exploring related Neolithic monuments in different parts of Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man. To this end, In July this year, the Boyne to Brodgar team produced this document as part of an intergovernmental consultation exercise between the Irish and Scottish governments, who are currently undertaking a review of Irish-Scottish relations in preparation for a post-Brexit future. God help us all. The aim is to identify areas where current cooperation can be enhanced and where new areas where collaborative work may be mutually beneficial can be identified. The final report was due out several months ago, but it's been a victim of COVID. But I'm assured by the Irish Consulate in Edinburgh that it is progressing. If, as a result, funds are made available for projects such as an international Neolithic monument trail, which allows people to compare for themselves the majestic and interlinked passage tombs of Newgrange and Maze How, for example, then Boyne to Brodgar will have proved its worth. The third objective is to empower local communities to appreciate, take pride in, and help to protect their prehistoric heritage by means of co-developing projects and a range of interpretation and learning resources relating to Neolithic monuments. This responds to and builds on the current wave of community archaeology initiatives led by various organisations that have proved to be so successful in the past few years, of which examples in Scotland have included Northlight Heritage's Build and Burn project on the Isle of Arran, where for the past few years, but obviously not this year, people have come together to build and then burn down a timber circle similar to the ones excavated on Macri Moor on Arran. Other examples include Archaeology Scotland's Adopt a Monument scheme. Here's the launch party for a passage tomb in northeast Scotland that was recently conserved by the local community under expert guidance, for example. And also the Scottish Rock Art Project, or SCRAP for short, which trains community groups to undertake 3D photogrammetric recording of rock art sites. This in particular is a project that could be extended to encompass Ireland's rich rock art heritage, which is so closely linked with Scotland's. And indeed, one of the inspirations for this project was the wonderful work in Ireland by the late, great Blaise O'Connor, who is much missed. So, how did Boyne to Brodgar come about? Well, back to 2012, when the late Professor Magdalena Midgley of the University of Edinburgh, whom you see at the centre of this slide, convened an international conference called Neolithic Scotland, Making Monuments, Creating Communities. This aimed to explore best practice as regards the investigation, conservation, and presentation of Neolithic monuments, and to apply this to Neolithic monuments in Scotland. Magda had been inspired by the fantastic achievement of Professor Johannes Müller of the University of Kiel, whom you see on the far right of this slide. Professor Müller is an alumnus of Edinburgh University, and at Kiel, he had managed to secure millions of euros from the German Research Foundation for a long-term research programme called Early Monumentality and Social Differentiation. Magda Midgley was on the steering group for that programme. And the programme is still flourishing. And in 2019, this massive set of 3 weighty tomes that constitute the proceedings of a 2015 conference was published. So, inspired by what Johannes had achieved, Magda set out to create a groundswell of enthusiasm in Scotland for emulating Johannes' success. And a committee was formed, chaired by Professor Gabriel Cooney of UCD, and supported by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland and AOC Archaeology. After Magdalena Midgley's untimely death in 2014, the group expanded the scope of the initiative to encompass Ireland and the Isle of Man, and that is how Boyne to Brodgar came about. It was met several times in various places, including Edinburgh, Dublin and Armagh, and it has consulted widely with stakeholders to scope out potential areas for collaboration and for undertaking projects. In addition to creating the research framework, we created a vision document, which was submitted in 2016 as part of an application to the European Union's Leader funding programme in Scotland. This didn't succeed, sadly, but we persevered. And we then presented a state of play session at the 2018 conference of the European Association of Archaeologists in Barcelona, which was very well received. Let's now look at the ways in which the Neolithics of Scotland, Ireland and the Isle of Man are intertwined, starting at the very beginning. The transformation from this Mesolithic way of life where all food had to be hunted, fished, or foraged, and where people had to move around seasonally to follow foodstuffs as they came into abundance. This one, based on producing food through growing cereals and keeping domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs, constituted a fundamental change, not only of lifestyle, but also of beliefs and worldviews. Archaeologists have been hotly debating for decades whether this change was caused by the immigration of farmers from the continent or by the indigenous hunter-fisher-forager communities of Britain and Ireland, choosing to adopt the radically different lifestyle, having regularly visited the continent. The only thing upon which these archaeologists could agree was the nuts and bolts of farming, that is, the cattle, sheep, and pigs, and the wheat, barley, oats, and flax must have been brought over from the continent, because the wild progenitors of the cereals, flax and sheep, simply did not exist in Britain and Ireland. And since we also know that cattle and pigs did not get domesticated here either. They were probably transported as young animals and as seed corn in curragh-like boats, like this one you see here, ferrying pigs to and from the Aran Islands that were in use up to the 20th century. Now, thanks to advances in DNA analysis and to major studies, including Lara Cassidy's recent study at Trinity College Dublin on Irish Mesolithic and Neolithic people, we can say for sure that the farming way of life was definitely introduced by immigrants from the continent, as indeed I have been arguing for decades. And Lara's study has blown out of the water the idea that Mesolithic groups sailed to and from the continent gaily, it has revealed that Ireland's earliest inhabitants were truly isolated and insular, with a genetic makeup distinct from that of their counterparts in Britain. The only place outside of Ireland where they may have travelled is the Isle of Man, to judge from the similarity in flint tools there. Moreover, because total genome DNA analysis enables people's skin, hair, and eye colour to be determined, we can also say that the incoming farmers looked different from the indigenous Mesolithic hunter-fisher foragers, being somewhat lighter skinned. As for where these immigrants had come from, this slide shows you my model of the various strands of Neolithization, which is based mainly on the variation in artifacts and monuments that the farmers used. While the DNA data don't yet provide the level of detail that allows us to distinguish people who come from the Morbihan region of Brittany from those who came from Nord-Pas-de-Calais or from Normandy, nevertheless, a recent French DNA study confirms that they did reach Britain and Ireland from more than one part of France. The two strands that reached both Britain and Ireland are numbers 2 and 3, as you see here. And I'll take you through each of these briefly now, starting with the one that came up the Atlantic facade from the Morbihan. This brought people who built these kinds of megalithic monuments, closed chambers and simple passage tombs, which will be most familiar to the Irish members of this audience from the cemetery at Carramore in County Sligo. The distribution of these monuments is markedly coastal, as you can see from this map. And the similarity between examples found in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland is very striking. While I suspect that the objects found in the excavated Irish examples at Carramore are most likely to relate to the secondary reuse of these monuments from around 3700 BC onwards, in Scotland, here at Achnacribeg on the west coast, not far from Oban, the pottery, like the monument itself, can be matched in Brittany. The monument started out as a closed chamber with a round cairn and then had a simple passage tomb added. And while the closed chamber had been completely emptied out by the time it was excavated in the 1960s, the passage tomb was found to contain the remains of 3 early Neolithic pots, including this one, with its rainbow motif, which is very topical these days. Another thing that connects this monument with its counterparts in Brittany is the presence of a fragment of rock crystal, which, as you all know, creates a rainbow effect if you hold it up to the sun. Now, one of the outstanding issues that needs to get sorted out both in Scotland and in Ireland is precisely when these Breton-style monuments were built. In Brittany, we know that they, and the late Castellic style of pottery that's found in them, date to between 4300 and 3900 BC. And I remain convinced that the Irish, Scottish and Welsh examples also date within this time bracket, probably around 4000 or 3900. Unfortunately, the monument at Achnacribeg didn't produce any radiocarbon datable material relating to its construction or initial use. A megalithic closed chamber at Merlee, far from Achnacribeg, produced cremated human bone that dates to around 3700 BC, showing that this kind of monument was in use by that time. Moreover, if you look at the ceramic family tree of the Achnacribeg pot, not only can you see how it fits in with the examples of late Castellic pottery found in Brittany and Normandy, but you can also see where it stands in relation to its so-called descendants, as it were, that have been found in a later and different kind of megalithic monument in southwest Scotland and northeast Ireland, dating to the 38th and 37th centuries BC. This is why I believe that the pins of bone and antwer from the Carramore Cemetery that have been radiocarbon dated by Robert Hensey and Stefan Berg to the centuries between around 3700 and 3000 BC relate not to the initial use of these monuments, but rather to their secondary reuse, along with the Irish-style Carrackill pottery, the small stone balls, and the pendants that accompanied them. There's one more piece of dating evidence from Ireland, and that's the fact that this monument at Glencoy on the North Antrim coast was found to overlie a layer containing early Neolithic pottery belonging to the carinated bowl tradition that I'll come on to in a minute. While some people might say, well, that means it's got to date to later than 3800 BC, that's not necessarily the case, as we'll see in a moment. The monument could date as early as 3900 BC. What we can say with some confidence is that these simple closed chamber and passage tomb monuments stand at the beginning of the long and the complex sequences of passage tomb development in both Ireland and Scotland, whereas in Wales, the tradition seems to have died out until the late 4th millennium, when folks emulated the Boyne Valley passage tomb builders. There isn't time to go into the question of why anyone should have wanted to up sticks in Brittany and sail northwards to an unknown destination. But if you want to hear that story and many others, I recommend that you tune into my series of Rind lectures for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland that will be broadcast between the 13th and the 18th of December. As far as the Boyne to Brodgar initiative is concerned, there are two key questions about this strand of Neolithization that still need to get resolved. The first is that question of precisely when they were constructed, and we can only answer that with fresh excavation, including keyhole excavation of remaining sediments that may relate to the construction of the Achnacribeg monument. The second question relates to the people who built and used these monuments and where they lived. We don't have any unburnt human remains that can be analysed for DNA from these monuments, unfortunately, nor has it been possible to pinpoint their settlements, despite attempts by Joran Burenhult back in the 1980s around the Carramore Cemetery. And given that these monuments tend to lie in areas that aren't regularly ploughed, we can't rely on field walking to pick up traces of the occupation. So we're still a way away from understanding these people. The second strand of Neolithization that I want to mention here is that which featured immigration from the Nord-Pas-de-Calais region of northern France, coming initially to the south and east coasts of Britain, then spreading very rapidly to Ireland via southern Scotland or northern England. This brought a different tradition of French Neolithic pottery, the carinated bowl tradition, or the Chassé-au-Michelsberg tradition if you really want, which I hasten to add also included uncarinated as well as carinated forms of pot, along with a tradition of building rectangular timber houses, including these gigantic communal halls, about 24 by 8 meters long and wide, that will have accommodated several families of incoming farmers as they established themselves in new farming land, before budding off and building smaller versions of the same shape of house. It also introduced a different set of funerary practices from those of the Breton immigrants, featuring the use of non-megalithic monuments, as you can see at the bottom left of this slide, and also of open-air cremation. And it also brought to Britain and Ireland these wonderful ceremonial green axe heads made of jadeite and other alpine rocks, which, thanks to an amazing French-led international project, Projet Jade, we're able to source to Monteviso and Montebegua in the North Italian Alps. Here are most of the Irish examples of these beautiful axe heads. And here, the fragment of one was found at Trenbourne in County Galway and spotted by the eagle-eyed Rosa Maldon just last year, having been initially misidentified by the excavators as a bead of Connemara marble. These were not everyday axe heads for chopping down trees. Instead, these were green treasures that had originally come from the magic mountains far away. And here you can see a block of jadeite on Monteviso, some 1,800 kilometers away from Mayo. And thanks to Projet Jade, we can say that many of the alpine axe heads found in Britain and Ireland will have been centuries old when they were brought over from northern France as treasured community heirlooms. If we take a very quick look at the funerary practices of these North French farmers, we can see here an artist's impression of the timber mortuary structures that were used to lay out the dead in many cases. These were usually then burnt down after a while, and then covered by a long rectangular or trapezoidal mound, or else a round mound. Sometimes, in their final form, they included a megalithic chamber and or facade, as you can see here at Loch Hill in southwest Scotland and at Ballymacaldrach in County Antrim. These diagrams show the sequences for Slucairn in southwest Scotland and for Ballymacaldrach, and you can see just how similar these monuments are across the North Channel from each other. As for when these northern French farmers came over and spread to Ireland, this is an issue that Boyne to Brodgar needs to investigate further, particularly as far as Ireland is concerned. There's clear evidence from southeast England that they had arrived as early as 4100 BC, and in Scotland the earliest evidence dates to around 3900 BC, but that doesn't mean that they landed in Kent and spread northwards, as Alistair Whittle has argued. In Ireland, while most of the evidence for the presence of the carinated bowl Neolithic dates to what's been termed the house horizon of the 38th to 37th centuries BC, when large numbers of rectangular houses were built, there's growing evidence for a carinated bowl presence before 3800 BC. At Machraboy in County Sligo, a large enclosure in which many people would gather together periodically has produced dates from short-lived material of around 4100 to 4000 BC. And at Rathquarter nearby, a couple of settlements have produced similarly early dates, albeit on oak charcoal. The Portal Tomb at Palnabrone, which is one regional development from the concept of the timber mortuary structure, found around the Irish Sea but not in Scotland, was in use from around 3885 to 3720 BC. And Professor Rick Schulting of Oxford University has obtained pre-3800 BC dates from cremated human remains from the Ballymacaldrach monument, whose construction phases we saw in the last slide. More than that I cannot divulge, as the dates are not yet published, but they are goodies. Incidentally, the facts that enough people were around to construct the large enclosure at Machraboy, and that none of the people buried at Palnabrone were related to each other, is consistent with the geneticist's claim that large numbers of people came over from the continent. Quite how many constitutes large numbers, they're not prepared to say, but it will certainly have been several hundred at the very least. So, Scotland and Ireland clearly share in common the origins of their Neolithics, as does the Isle of Man, since the carinated bowl strand reached there too. And it's clear that, once established, these farmers from that carinated bowl tradition interacted with each other across and around the Irish Sea, with objects, people, and ideas moving around networks of contacts that were important for maintaining social connections and for ensuring the flow of goodies such as high-quality flint from Antrim. You can see the interaction, the shared design of the megalithic monuments that were being built in southwest Scotland, much of the northern half of Ireland, and the Isle of Man from around 3750 or 3700 BC. These represent translations into stone of the initial non-megalithic tradition of using timber mortuary structures, And in southwest Scotland, you can see an intermediate stage in this process in this monument at Cairnholy 1. The end result of this process of architectural evolution is called Clyde Cairns in southwest Scotland, court tombs in Ireland. Isn't a distinctive name for them in the Isle of Man, but you can see here how they are all of a piece with their counterparts to the north and west. To underline this close connection around the northern part of the Irish Sea, here's a photograph of arrowheads made from fine Antrim flint that were found in the Clyde Cairn at Giant's Graves North on Arran. The increasing number of radiocarbon dates for Clyde Cairns in southwest Scotland has allowed Rick Schulting to argue that they were in existence by about 3750 BC. This compares closely with the date of around 3700 BC we got for the appearance of court tombs in Ireland. These connections between Ireland and Scotland, and to a lesser extent with the Isle of Man, continued throughout the Neolithic period. And we can see them, for example, in other finds of Antrim flint artifacts that have turned up in southwest Scotland, including this magnificent hoard of axe heads, flakes and knives found at Auchenhowen near Campbelltown at the southern tip of the Kintyre Peninsula. We can also see it in the occasional finds of Arran pitchstone, a kind of volcanic glass very similar to obsidian, that have turned up in northeast Ireland, and also in the near identical pottery that's been found in some Clyde Cairns and court tombs. You'll remember that this particular kind of pot has its roots way back in Breton pottery. These short distance connections are reminiscent of the kind of contacts that people had in the 19th century, where it was actually easier for people living on the Antrim Plateau to go across to Scotland to the markets than it was to trek towards Belfast. Some of the Irish-Scottish Neolithic connections were further flung, as we can see from these sherds of Hebridean Neolithic jars that were found at Portstewart on the coast of County Derry. These date to between 3600 and 3300 or 3200 BC. And also from this spectacular complete axe found at Shulashada on the outer Hebridean island of Lewis. The haft has been dated to between 3300 and 3000 BC, and the axe head is of porcelainite from either Teve Bullia or from Rathlin Island in County Antrim. And more generally, one can trace ceramic connections between Scotland and Ireland, especially northeast Ireland, right the way through from the early to the late 4th millennium BC, and indeed after that as well. But from around 3200 BC, a much more spectacular set of evidence relating to our interdigitating Neolithics is to be found. And here we return to the world of the passage tomb builders and users in Ireland to pick up the story. If you trace the overall development of Irish passage tombs over the course of the 4th millennium, a clear process of aggrandizement can be detected. People were building bigger and better versions of the houses of the dead, as we can see here in the Carramore Cemetery and environs, where, around 3500 BC, the large Listowel mound was constructed in among the small, simple passage tombs of the early Neolithic cemetery. We don't yet have a date for the massive Queen Maeve's cairn on the top of Knocknarea overlooking that cemetery. You can actually see it as that tiny pimple on the horizon in the picture at the top. But my money is on it dating to around the time when the huge passage tombs of Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth were built in the Boyne Valley, sometime around 3200 BC. You can see the same process occurring with other passage tombs, as here in the Loch Crew Cemetery in County Meath. And here, on Baltinglass Hill in County Wicklow, where a recent dating programme has revealed that the earliest monument is very early indeed, as you can see here, and that there were successive makeovers to create a larger and more elaborate monument during the middle and the late 4th millennium. Out-and-out winners in this process of competitive conspicuous consumption were, of course, the people who built the mega passage tombs at Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth, superimposing the first two, at least, on pre-existing cemeteries of smaller passage tombs. Dating programs at Newgrange and Knowth have established that these huge monuments were built around 3200 to 3100 BC. And it's clear that the builders indulged in what Mary Helms has referred to as cosmological acquisition, traveling to distant places to bring back grand designs and sometimes exotic items. Here, for example, you can see how the addition of a long passage at an angle to the original northwest tomb made it resemble one of the angled passage tombs, or allées coudées, of the Morbihan area of Brittany. Well, here you can see how the so-called guardian figure guarding the entrance to the innermost part of northwest has a striking resemblance to other guardian figures in these allées coudées in the Morbihan. Not to put too fine a point on it, these figures are referred to as goddesses because they appear to be representations of vulvas with eyes. Yep, look long enough and you can see it. Powerful stuff. And the resemblances between Brittany and Ireland are not what you'd expect to see happening by sheer chance. Moreover, it has been argued that the dense, high relief style of passage tomb art, seen mainly, but by no means exclusively at Newgrange, recalls the dense, high relief art seen in the older passage tomb of Gavrinis in the Morbihan. And the long distance voyaging of the Irish tomb builders seems to have gone yet further. As far as Galicia, in the case of this small pebble carved like a foot from Newgrange, which has been recognized as an argalo-type idol from Galicia, northwest Spain, and this distinctly shaped object from Nauf, for which the closest and indeed the only parallels are to be found around the mouth of the Tagus in Portugal. Something that has enriched our understanding of the builders of Irish passage tombs yet further has been the publication this summer of Lara Cassidy's major DNA study of prehistoric Irish human remains, which has discovered not only that the builders of Irish passage tombs were related to each other over centuries and over long distances within Ireland, but also that one man buried in Newgrange was the offspring of an incestuous union. Boy, did that get the Twittersphere all a Twitter. Oh my gosh. This finding has sparked off a major debate within and beyond archaeology about the nature of the society that was responsible for building these mega passage tombs. While I wouldn't go so far as the geneticists in arguing for a society that was approaching state level in its degree of hierarchy and control, I certainly don't side with the archaeologists who poo-poo the idea that society was not highly differentiated at the time. In my opinion, it beggars belief to argue that the immense task of building one of these mega passage tombs from scratch, bringing in massive amounts of resources from near and far, was not done by a society where some people were much more equal than others. And to my mind, the evidence for incest could relate to a strategy of maintaining some notional purity in the bloodline of the dominant lineage. Just as the whole process of building bigger and better monuments to the dead was a strategy of enhancing and maintaining power by a small number of elite groups. Indeed, at Newgrange, by orientating the monument so that the rays of the rising sun on midwinter solstice would travel along the passage into the chamber, as you can see here, the builders could claim that they had the power to control the very movement of the sun. No doubt we can discuss all this after the end of this lecture, but it makes the point that we definitely do need to discuss the nature of late 4th millennium society. And that's one of the things that the Boyne to Brodgar research framework has identified as a priority. This is particularly important as we know relatively little about where and how the Irish passage tomb people were living at the time, and whether their subsistence economy was dominated at that time by cattle herding. There is a school of thought that says that there had been a collapse in arable farming from around 3500 BC to at least 3200 BC, although not everybody would go along with that model. Returning to our theme of connectedness, in Scotland, we can also see a process of competitive conspicuous consumption being played out in the aggrandizing of funerary monuments from as early as around 3500 BC, as you can see here with the superimposition of massive long-horned cairns on top of pre-existing passage tombs in the old county of Caithness. This is interesting as it implies the cultural reorientation of these Atlantic-style passage tombs into monuments that have the long rectangular cairns of the carinated bowl tradition. Is this a case of cultural imposition and appropriation, perhaps? I think it probably was. You can see this process in play in Orkney as well, where at one or two places around 3500 BC, people chose to build long-horned cairns, as here at Point of Cot on the island of Westray. These are significantly larger than the passage tombs that will have been built before that in Orkney, and they seem to refer to the much larger long-horned cairns of the northern mainland that you can see here, reminding us that the farmers of Orkney maintained close links with their counterparts in the northern part of Scotland. Another Orcadian variant on the aggrandizement theme was the construction of supersized stalled cairns, especially on the island of Rousey, where you can see these massive examples at Midhow and Rowigar. Now, while these could be interpreted as a nice egalitarian coming together of several communities, one wonders why several such gigantic tombs were built in close proximity on a small island. And rather like the builders of medieval cathedrals, I suspect it was more of an expression of mine's bigger and better than yours. The killer move, this inflationary spiral of competitive conspicuous consumption, was that made by some particularly ambitious, prosperous Orcadian farmers who will have heard all about the wonders of the Boyne Valley through their pre-existing contacts that they had with people in the Outer Hebrides who, as we've already seen, were in contact with folks in Ireland. These people, these rich cowboys in Orkney, made the long-distance sea journey to the Boyne Valley. And they came back with grand designs and, it would seem, some exotic goodies as well. These were the people who built Maze Howe and other similar passage tombs, and who introduced the notion of orientating the houses of the dead on astronomically significant phenomena. They also introduced passage tomb art to Orkney. Where did they get those ideas? Well, in the Boyne Valley, of course. The design of using, I'm in the way, I realise. There you go. The design of using chambers with recessed cells, and particularly the cruciform design of Maze Howe, was directly lifted from Newgrange, as was its orientation on the midwinter solstice sun, although at Maze Howe it's the setting sun that was marked rather than the rising sun, and one assumes that they couldn't get the sun to do its thing at sunrise within the specific topography of that part of Orkney. Similarly, the use of passage tomb art in other Maze Howe type passage tombs in Orkney is directly lifted from the Boyne Valley, even if the conjoined spiral motif was given its own Orcadian twist, as it were. And these thrusting cowboys of Orkney were even more ambitious than that. We know that they must have sailed as far as the continent, because this little critter here, the Orkney vole, has a distinctive genetic signature that indicates that it can only have been introduced to Orkney by boat in a single journey from the continent. Its date of arrival in Orkney falls within the window of 3200 to 3100, when we know that folks were sailing to the Boyne Valley. And while it's most unlikely that these little things were stowaways, it is likely that they will have been carried on board as a tasty and self-replenishing source of food, rather like the dormice that Roman sailors kept on board, since we know that voles and dormice breed like rabbits. Boom, boom. Moreover, work by André Romaniuk of Edinburgh University has shown that at Skara Brae in Orkney, people were catching, cooking and eating Orkney voles, and it is found charring on the extremities, consistent with their being roasted on a stick. And, fantastically, CT scanning of dog lights, that's turds to you and me, from Skara Brae has shown that dogs were eating Orkney voles as well. So the ones on the boats could have been vol au vent, perhaps, or rodent Josh, ha ha ha, and I thank Mac Copper for that particularly dreadful pun. To these adventurous cowboys, these people set out to, and succeeded in, creating a new world order in Orkney, featuring themselves on top. They invented a new kind of monument, the stone circle enclosed by a henge, building the stones of Steness around 3000 BC. They invented a wholly new style of pottery, grooved ware, with its flat bases, which incorporated some motifs of passage tomb art. They made and wore ostentatious jewellery. Perhaps the large dress pins of walrus ivory and bone echoed the long Irish pins of bone and antler. And they used a dizzying variety of weapons for bashing people on the bonce. And we know from a number of skulls that have blunt force trauma that they weren't afraid to use them. Into their arsenal of prestigious and personalised weapons, these people in Orkney adopted the carved stone balls that were so popular in northeast Scotland. This one in Towie, from Towie in Aberdeenshire, has a spiral design that is particularly reminiscent of Newgrange, which suggests that folks from northeast Scotland were also travelling to the Boyne Valley. And indeed, people at the Orcadians might have got the idea for using stone balls in the first place from having acquired a couple of smooth polished ones from Ireland. Here, for example, you see examples from Loch Crew. Here, you see one from Westray and another from just Scotland that look suspiciously similar. Now, these have turned up in the National Museum's collections. They've been with us for over 100 years, and I'm delighted that Hugo Anderson Weimark agrees with me that I bet these were probably imports from Ireland. We need to do geological work on them, but that's what they certainly look like. And we also know that Orcadians didn't just visit the Boyne Valley once, around 3200 BC. They kept on going back, as we can tell from these examples of grooved ware, which date to around 2800 BC, that have particularly close similarities to Newgrange designs. So the one at the bottom has the design from the curbstone at the back of Newgrange that is directly opposite the entrance. Among the innovations associated with these people was a design of houses that looked different from the traditional houses and more like maze house type passage tombs. And they also lived in nucleated settlements for the first time. And at Barn House, they added a huge community building where they will all have had feasts. And at the amazing site of Ness of Brodgar nearby, they built bigger and bigger houses, topping these off with an enormous structure. It seems that they succeeded in stealing some of the limelight from the Boyne Valley, making Orkney a new wonder of the ancient world and the must-visit location for ceremonies. Perhaps these huge piered buildings supporting stone roofs were constructed so that elite could entertain visitors from far and wide abroad. It's quite possible. And we know that these people had quite an influence on people elsewhere. Here, for example, you can see how the practice of building stone and timber circles spread along the western side of Scotland, along the Atlantic facade, along with the use of grooved ware. It's a similar picture from the east, and indeed, early style grooved ware has been found as far away as County Cork and in Wessex in the far south of England, many hundreds of kilometres away. And you can see the influence of the Boyne Valley too, on the Boyne Valley too. So this grooved ware pot from the passage tomb number 6 at Nauf could be lost among the Orcadian grooved ware. And indeed, the little bone pendant is a miniature of the mace heads that were used in Orkney. Moreover, the very famous decorated mace head from the eastern tomb at Nauf that you see on the top left has an Orcadian style spiral design. And while we can't prove that it was made in Orkney, you don't get flint like that there. Nevertheless, it could have been produced in Orkney, and procured through links with Orkney. And indeed, the whole practice of using mace heads and miniature mace head pendants in Ireland could have been adopted through links with Orkney. But my very favourite piece of evidence was shown to me many years ago by Kerry Cleary, who asked me if I recognised what this tiny bead from Nauf was. Imagine my delight. It's actually a miniature version of a Scottish 6-knobbed carved stone ball. Fantastic. So I realised that time has romped away, goodness me, and I still want to tell you a little bit about the great research that's being done under the Boyne to Brodgar umbrella. If you'll bear with me, this will only take a couple of minutes. We're delighted that Dr. Jessica Smith has agreed to badge her Passage Tomb People project under the Boyne to Brodgar initiative. It's funded by the Irish Research Council, and it's looking at the diet and the movement patterns of Passage Tomb people in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And we look forward very much to the results of this important work. We're also delighted that Professor Gabriel Cooney and Dr. Will McGarry's North Row Fellsite project, which is looking at quarrying of fellsite in Shetland, is also part of the Boyne to Brodgar portfolio, and it complements Professor Cooney's work at Lamb Bay, where stone was also quarried for making axe heads. And we're thrilled Dr. Richard Bates's brand new project, looking at the satellite stone circles around Callanish on the island of Lewis, and exploring other sub-peat archaeology in the area, is also badged as a Boyne to Brodgar project. This has been funded by Historic Environment Scotland as part of its current Year of Coasts and Waters initiative. Finally, we salute the efforts of Dr. Steve Davis of UCD, working with our colleagues from the German Archaeological Institute, who have been systematically undertaking geophysical and other survey, both in Orkney and in the Boyne Valley, for the past few years. Here you see the fruits of some of their work in Orkney. And here is a tiny sample of their extensive work in the Boyne Valley. I don't propose to go into the interpretation of their findings, since that's something which is going to be published in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society very soon, and will also be featured in a book about Boyne to Brodgar that's due to be published by the German Archaeological Institute in 2021. Clearly, all this work requires a huge program of targeted excavation to ground truth the findings of these truly cutting-edge surveys. And that's something that we can hope will fall under the aegis of the Boyne to Brodgar initiative as well. And in the meantime, you can read a very nice blog that was made by our German colleagues in 2019. So the future looks bright for Boyne to Brodgar. And among the other initiatives in the pipeline is a project called Awakening the Giants, by Dr. Gavin McGregor of Northlight Heritage, who hopes to work on the fantastic chamber tombs of the Isle of Arran and do this as a community co-production initiative. So fingers crossed that the Irish-Scottish intergovernmental consultation comes up with a whole load of moolah that will allow us to do all these wonderful collaborative things, which will help everybody share in the wonderful connectedness of Neolithic, Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. So much that you've been working on, and so many fantastic discoveries that are coming from that, and so many more questions to follow through. I got to say, I wasn't keeping an eye on the questions and answers coming through because that talk was very, very good, but we have a few that have come in. And certainly if anybody else would like to join in with the questions and answers, please do. So starting off the first, from Brady K, I don't know if that, is that Kieran? You showed a picture of the Schildeshatter hafted stone axe. Do you know of many other examples of hafted stone axes from Britain or Ireland?
Fantastic question. There are fewer than a dozen. They are very, very rare indeed, and they only survive in waterlogged environments. And we were very lucky with the Schildeshatter one because it must have been thrown into a lake, possibly as a votive deposit, because why else would you throw away a perfectly preserved, complete axe? And certainly the Irish Stone Axe Project made a listing of the Irish finds, and also the Irish Wetland Archaeology Project. I can't remember offhand whether they found one or two there, but certainly they are very, very rare indeed, Neolithic ones. Yeah.
Just on that particular one, the way that the hafting goes in, one can't see the butt of the axe. Was it particularly diagnostic or connected into a particular type, or?
The idea is that you make the haft to fit the axe head and to make it fit very snugly so that it's not going to fall out. And off the top of my head, I think it just sticks out of the back a little bit, but they vary an awful lot. So there was one that was found at Ionside Tarn in Cumbria over 100 years ago, and the back of the butt of that axe head stuck out a lot further. But the whole thing was to prevent them from flying off when you're using them.
Yes. And for just the last question on that one, did the axe head itself show much sign of wear, or is that sort of back to a votive deposit that was in pristine condition?
That's a very good question. In fact, I wrote it up way back in 1992, and I can't remember what I said. And it's on display at in the Early People Gallery in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and you can actually go and see it if you book, but that's going to encourage us to go and have another look at it. I mean, as far as I remember, the blade is pretty sharp and it hasn't got damage on it, but whether it had been used and resharpened, that's something which we can now do, because in the National Museum's Collection Centre, we have a fantastic photomicroscopy set up. And so we can get the thing taken off display and we can check it out there. So that's a very good question.
We can sort of see how that earlier research for the Stone Axe project has a currency going forward again too.
Absolutely.
Next question up here is from Joe Femick. Thanks, Joe. Given the importance of the North-South Atlantic seaways throughout the Neolithic, has there been any evidence of shipping or harbours from this time identified?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, we wouldn't really expect to find, if they were using curragh-like boats, these are basically very, very light. They're a light wooden structure with animal hide over them. With or without, you wouldn't have needed harbours, you wouldn't have needed any constructed places for landing a boat like that. What they would do is to seek out good landing sites, so soft landings, so good bays, maybe sandy bays or whatever, that are not going to tear a hole in the bottom of the boat. Certainly they have found plenty of dugout canoes, including a Neolithic one that was found in Northern Ireland, but you wouldn't use that for crossing that dangerous bit of sea where Boris Johnson may or may not be building a bridge over the ordnance at the bottom, because dugouts are best suited for either going around lakes or going up and down rivers. And at the very best, you might stay inland, might sort of go very close to the coast, but you really, really wouldn't want to cross the sea in one of those things. So hello, Joe. Hope that answers your question.
I think too, in Strangford Lough and some of the County Antrim, County Down side, there's evidence of cleared where the stones, just as you were saying, the stones that would rip the backside of a boat have been cleared away. But obviously, because they've been cleared away, there's very, very little by way of dating evidence that goes behind them.
Yeah.
But there may be opportunity there to research a bit further.
Fantastic. And I've remembered the first name of the guy who makes these boats is Clive. So somebody else can fill in the second.
Thanks. Next we have here from Sam Moore and IT Sligo. Thanks very much, Sam, who designed the B2B logo.
Sam, you're wonderful.
Sam was asked about a Neolithic pit complex at Ballydugan of 3947 to 3762, Calgary, BC. Can be added to the early dates of Marraboy and Rathquarter.
Fantastic.
And in terms of Lara Cassidy's paper, Sam's agreeing that there's nothing to support. There is nothing to suggest near state social organisation. But Alison, would you agree with developing elites amongst house societies, social organisation?
Personally, I don't like the use of the term house societies, because it's something that's been lifted from Claude Lévi-Strauss without necessarily understanding the ins and outs of the anthropological model there. However, yes, indeed, I would say that these are socially differentiated societies. Yes. The reason why Lara's team were talking about, are they nearly on the way to state society, is that they were saying, okay, where else in the world and around time do you find the practice of incest? And yes, it's true, you find it in ancient Egypt, you find it in, I think you find it in Mesoamerica. But certainly, I don't think it's at all appropriate to Ireland, because if you had a near state society, you would expect the kind of things that you see in Aztec or Maya society, these gigantic monumental, plazas and heaven knows what, that kind of thing. And I think what's really ironic is we know so little about the houses and the settlements where the builders of the passage tombs lived. And, what we've got underneath Knowth is these sort of rather modest circular-ish structures, and you think that doesn't really chime with a highly differentiated society. So actually I would be very interested in hearing your views, Sam, on this whole question. And I think that this is something which is going to be discussed, because there's a lot of heated debate at the moment about it.
Thanks. Next question we have here is from Michaela. Michaela, thank you very much for your lecture. And I just wonder, why would someone, or why would you think that carved stone balls were weapons? Would some of them be so highly decorated as, for example, the toy ball, if they would be weapons? And Michaela's also talking about having actually made one of these based on a stone found near Elgin. It took 19 hours and 25 minutes, and the decoration obviously requiring careful work.
Yeah.
And clearly those stone balls aren't particularly damaged. So are they weaponry or ornamental, I suppose?
Okay. And Michaela, I do hope that having made replica, you mark it in some way, because one of the huge bugbears of the study of carved stone balls is we know that in the 19th century, people were deliberately faking some of these things. And we know that in the 20th century, people are making replicas out of interest. But let's avoid future archaeologists getting confused by these things. So if you can mark it indelibly, that'd be great. Basically, yes, in Orkney, there are quite a few skulls that have depressed blunt fracture trauma on them. Yeah, in fact, on different parts of the skull. And Dave Lawrence did a fantastic study of the skulls from Isbister and a couple of other chamber tombs in Orkney, and he's found that there's quite a high incidence of this kind of damage. It would, excuse me, if you hit somebody on the head with a carved stone ball, it'll damage the head. It's not going to damage the ball, because very often the stone is quite hard. Why you would bother to decorate it is that these things are absolutely, they are weapons, but they're also weapons of social exclusion. These are symbols of power, which to a certain extent would be personalized. And that's a really interesting thing in Orkney. There is such a wide variety of these weapons. You can get, pointy ones that look like a hand grenade, as I know to my expense when I flew up with it through the X-ray thing up to Orkney one day. When I unwrapped it for the X-ray people, they were none the wiser, but at least it wasn't going to explode. And I think that, even though you get a lot of 6 knobbers and 4 knobbers and all that, nevertheless, within Orkney, you could choose, or you could recognize that weapon that's just hit you on the head. Oh yeah, that belongs to so-and-so because it's it's that kind of weapon. It's a mace head, it's a cushion mace head, or it is a 3-spiked thingy. So I think that's what that was all about with carved stone balls.
And would there be much of a distinction in terms of the deposition of those balls, or
very, 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 very few of them have been found in any context whatsoever. And if you listen to my Rind lectures, you'll hear me going through the Orcadian contexts. That's where the best evidence is. There was one that was found in Norway at the bottom of a field clearance cairn in 1948. And we can only assume that that had been found in Scotland by a Viking, because our Vikings came from Norway, and that they took it back to Norway as a curiosity. And for one reason or another, it ended up at the bottom of this heap of stones.
Oh, there's Stephen Mandel has come in. It's Clive O'Givney.
Hello.
The Boyne,
yes, that's the one. Thank you, Steve. You're my external hard drive. Thank you.
Next, just on the note, Edward Pollard's asking, is there any evidence of Neolithic boats in Scotland? Just back in, you were mentioning earlier on about the dugouts and the curraghs.
To my knowledge, the very earliest dugout that we have is of Chalcolithic date, which, and I wish I could remember, it's from somewhere in southwest Scotland, but I don't think we are lucky enough. In Ireland, it was from Strangford Lough, the one that was Neolithic in date. But elsewhere, of course, there are dugouts that are Neolithic, and in continental Europe, I think there might be pre-Neolithic ones as well.
Okay, thanks. Next, going on to Neil Jackman, and then there's a couple of questions that are sort of maybe interconnected about some of the motivation for people moving. Neil says, "Thank you so much for a truly wonderful presentation." He's quite right there. Neil's particularly interested. Particularly as a Seahan, it looks like one large passage tomb.
Okay, I'm sorry, you got hung up for just a little tiny second. Could you, say it again?
So Neil is particularly interested in the Neolithic activity in the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains, and about the discussion on the reuse of tombs. Particularly at Seahan, where it looks like one large passage tomb had its cairn completely robbed away to create a new cairn next door. With the dates at Baltinglass broadly overlapping with the nearby hill fort at Spinnans Hill, do you think there may be more evidence of new people coming in? And I'm thinking, is that a hill fort, or it's a fort, or a...
That's a really good question, but I would really need to see what the context of the early date is from the hill fort, because my understanding is that the hill forts aren't that early.
Mm-hmm.
So could it be that there was Neolithic activity on this nearby hill,
Mm-hmm.
onto which a hill fort was subsequently built? That's quite possible.
Yeah. I guess we'd maybe at a different time maybe ask you a few questions about the causeway camps and maybe some of the review of those, particularly given the earlier or the dates for Lyle's Hill and Donegal and then the others outside of Derry. And more of them have been turning up with a lot of development-led work too. So that opportunity to start to harvest the dates and harvest the information from them.
Fantastic.
A couple of questions now on some of the movement about. Joe has asked about what kind of imperatives do you think might have led to people leaving northern France, and I know it'd be a bit hypothetical, but
good. Well, for the carbonated bowl Neolithic, you can relate that back to long-term demographics within the Paris Basin. So we know that people have been farming there for over 1,000 years by the time they left Nord-Pas-de-Calais. And it seems as though there was a build-up of population, because we know that farming communities tend to have lots of children, because children will, you need them to help tending the animals and to look after the crops and all that. So whereas groups of hunter-gatherer fishers will keep their population quite low within their carrying capacity, farmers tend to have bigger families. And so over time, Paris Basin got full up, or at least people perceived it to be full. And we know from the DNA work that's been done about the genesis of the so-called Michelsberg culture, that people were moving out of the Paris Basin in various directions. So northeastwards, eastwards, and also northwestwards towards Normandy from around 4,300 BC. And we think that the groups that came from Nord-Pas-de-Calais were one of a set of regional groups that had come from the Paris Basin. They had settled, some of them stayed in Nord-Pas-de-Calais, but other ones could see the white cliffs of Dover across the sea and thought, okay, we'll give it a go. And for whatever reason, some of them sailed much, much further up the east coast of Britain. Okay. And as far as the people who came from Brittany are concerned, there had been an amazing society that was very, very macho indeed, around 4,600 BC. And these people featured leaders who were kind of almost like theocratic leaders. They thought of themselves as gods, and they had themselves buried in ginormous burial monuments. One of them at Tumulus Saint-Michel near Carnac is so big that they built a medieval chapel on top of it. That's to show you the scale of it, And yet, sometime around 4,300 BC, they also erected these incredibly large standing stones, these sort of phallic standing stones, and they got some of the longest jadeite axe heads in Europe. And so there was this sort of parallel between axe head as penis, sorry for the word, standing stone as penis, all of which emphasize the male concept of fertility and power. There seems to have been an earth tremor which led a lot of these big menhirs to fall over. And then after that, they started to build passage tombs, which is a completely different kind of monument there, which means that you can actually get into them, and they're more like the shape of a womb. And Serge Cassen and Christine Bougeot have talked about a different kind of society which emphasized female concepts of fertility rather than male at the time. And so it was within that milieu where major social change had happened. And we know that there had been a tradition of sailing long distances for many, many years. So even from the Mesolithic, people in Brittany were very skilled navigators. And we know that they went down to Iberia during the Neolithic, that's fine. They went again about the same time as they came north to Achlenkreberg. So, it was certainly well within their capabilities to sail long distances to the north.
Following on from that, and to combine two questions now, one from Niamh Whitfield and another from Anne-Marie Scott. Niamh was asking in terms of a controversial question about the Newgrange Wall, and would you go along with Brian O'Kelly's argument that links between Ireland and Brittany support the view that there was a stone wall at Newgrange? And I'm not just familiar with which stone wall that would be meant there, but also then tied to that Anne-Marie Scott's question about, and you've already started touching into that, about the changing perspective about what's the nature of the deity that is being observed or is being incorporated into this. Has asked about Maria Gimbutas's theories of the goddess and connection. So I suppose on one hand that links between Ireland and Brittany and whether or not there was a wall at Newgrange. Or are we seeing that bit of representation then coming into Gimbutas's view of the nature of the goddess?
About the wall at Newgrange, I'm not sure whether you're referring to the way that O'Kelly reconstructed the facade at the front of the tomb, and if you could maybe confirm whether that's what you're talking about or not, because I know that the angle of that was very controversial. And I'm not really qualified to talk very much about that. I know that Gabriel Cooney has written on that subject quite a lot. I mean, I think it's reasonable to assume that, yes, it would have been quite steep. And clearly there was collapse. You know, it was almost too steep for its own good, so there was collapse. Whether they decorated it with using the darker stone, whether they had spiral patterns or whatever, thank heavens he chose not to do that, because I think that would have been a kind of interpretation way too far. And as far as the sort of female goddess thing is concerned, Maria Gimbutas came from a time when people wanted to see big long distance connections and big long lasting traditions. And I think nowadays we have to be much more cautious in judging those older interpretations. So for example, she would take examples from here, there and everywhere. She would say, oh, look, you know, in Denmark, they've got these pots with these eyes on, they look a bit like goddess eyes, that kind of thing. And she would weave together a big story. And I think we wouldn't really dare to do that now. You have to be much more source critical and say, okay, you know, we know, or we can say that X is roughly contemporary with Y because we've got good radiocarbon dating from area X and area Y. Mm-hmm. In other places or in other circumstances, it's a bit more speculative. And it's very interesting that a lot of work has been done recently on the idols of Iberia by Mimi Boyne, and colleagues. And so, yeah, we're, you know, all the time we're improving our understanding of the artifacts that we so gaily compare with each other in different areas. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing to note about the Irish Breton links is that the tombs don't have to be absolutely contemporary. So that Gavrinis, as far as we know, I think it was built about, oh golly, 3,900 or so, and it might have reused stones that were already decorated from elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But having been built, it was available then. You know, people go and visit it thereafter for many centuries afterwards. And so it's not a case of saying that Newgrange is contemporary with Gavrinis. It's that they had visited Gavrinis and they got ideas from there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important point to note.
Yeah, well, that longevity of use by the ancient societies that were using them is an incredible thing, because quite often that can get overlooked as an episode that created the thing. Yeah. And then a really long life then that happens after that, and the development of the connections beyond it. Yeah. Sinead McCartan there. Hi, Sinead. Sinead's asked, have you had an opportunity to look at the Neolithic pottery from Knockins up on Rathlin Island? So this is a connection a lot closer to make, just on the northern tip of County Antrim. Not personally, but I would absolutely love to. And now that I'm retired, yay! As soon as we get over this horrible thing, I have a £74 EasyJet voucher to be used by next July or June. So yeah, if they'll let me at it, I would love to have a look at it. Well, I think Sinead may be keen for you to get a look at the archives up in the Ulster Museum then for those. That was some work that Helen Roach had taken forward with those. Sam, there's just Sam Moore's come back just about some of the discussion about the incest issues. I'd come across a reference to a Roman census record in papyrus showing 20% of Ptolemy period Egyptian marriages were between brothers and sisters. Yeah. And we'd definitely love to talk more in the social rankings and like Mary Helms and Gillespie's work on this. So there's clearly that the discoveries in the press release earlier on this year certainly sparked a brand new series of conversations about this. Let me see. Now, Adrienne has asked, is there a connection with the monuments in Malta and Gozo? You think in terms of these megalithic ones? That's and again, that goes back to Maria Gimbutas. You know, people saw the spirals in Malta and Gozo, and they thought, aha, spirals in Newgrange here. So in the 1950s, you'll see and before that, a lot of people writing about these connections, and they talked about megalithic missionaries. You know, as if people were taking the idea of building megalithic monuments from one place to another. And we can now say absolutely no connection with Malta. Yeah, but also, I mean, nowadays we do have studies like Bettina. Crikey,
I'll remember her name in half a second, where she looked at all of the radiocarbon dates on megalithic monuments, particularly passage tombs across Europe, and she said, aha, okay, it looks as if they spread from Brittany or Iberia or both those places. But as with all these big picture things, again, you have to be so very difficult, very, very careful, because the devil is in the detail. And she ended up sort of implying, maybe she didn't mean to, that the passage tombs you get in Denmark could have been inspired by passage tombs in Scotland. And that's absolutely not the case at all. So again, I think, caution is the watchword, but now we've got so many tools that we can use. It's great. And, I'm not decrying the work that she did. And I think what we need to do is to write big picture stories and then very detailed regional and local stories, because it's only by tacking between the two that we get these really nice nuanced narratives that we can build up.
Well, coming into that sort of local perspective then forward, where you're getting that sort of differentiation, that's maybe an area that you're familiar with now in terms of the sites. Stephen McGlade, again, wonderful lecture, and thank you very much. Stephen was saying that he has read previously that the smaller and simpler passage tombs in the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains and the Dublin coast were linked to an earlier tradition. And would you see that as being the case, or would that be the same as he's referenced a lost cemetery at Kilmonaster up in Donegal in the northwest of Ireland?
Yes, I mean, way back in 1986, I wrote an article called Megaliths and Megalomania, where I tried to look at all of the passage tombs in Ireland and say, can we see a process of development over time? And yes, it does. And I know that Robert Hensley has now taken this topic up. And there's a general move from small and simple at the very beginning to large and elaborate later on. And it's not necessarily a unilinear thing, and not everybody is going to be able to build a bigger and better monument. So at the same time as they were building the huge Newgrange, Knowth and Dowth, they might have been building the smaller but no less important Mound of the Hostages at Tara, for example. And likewise, after they built the really big ones, they built one or two smaller ones in the Boyne Valley. So again, I think the message is we need to have a whole load more radiocarbon dates. And I really applaud Robert and Stefan Berg and Thomas Cardor for the work that they've been doing on getting dates for Carramore and Carrakiel. Keep on it, folks. There's a and also Knowth and Newgrange. These important dates help us all to build our chronological narrative, and they're so important.
Absolutely. Well, in terms of there's another site now that's mentioned here that I'm not familiar with. Aidan Carley has asked who's responsible for Dronehenge. Not sure, are you familiar with that site?
Dronehenge, is that, well, I mean, there are various Dronehenges. Is that the one in the Boyne Valley?
I might be maybe I would take from the question there, maybe it is to do with the further discoveries that were thrown up by the...
I think it is, yes. So the work that Knut Rassmann and Steve Davis have been doing in the Boyne Valley included various drone surveys, yes. Yes, and in fact, the whole issue about the dating of the henges in Ireland, it remains an open question. We've been looking at them for so long, and yet really very few have been excavated, and Dowth indeed is a wonderful candidate. Because I mean, David Sweetman's work was very, very important in finding a Carrakiel bowl, I think in the bank in one of the henges there, and also finding beaker activity, which was presumably secondary. And also, up in Ballinhatty, the Giant's Ring has got a very early passage tomb right in the middle of it. But when the Giant's Ring itself was built, we can only speculate.
Aidan's come back to say there's a Dronehenge mentioned in one of the captions in the slides, so maybe get a chance to look back on the YouTube.
Yeah, that's the one. That's definitely the one.
Freeze that one.
Yeah.
So on that, I know again with the development-led work that has happened across Ireland, there have been more hengiform type monuments have started to come to be identified. And you had mentioned Ballinhatty. They're not terribly far away from that at the north of Stratford Lough. There's a small hengiform complex, is probably the best way to describe it, possibly three beside one another. An interesting thing just in those sites is the nature of the monumentality you're getting in the Newgrange and the Boyne area. There's those series of very large monuments that have now been identified and are being recognised more commonly.
Yes.
And then you would look, say, once you come back in the Arcadian world, where a different expression of monumentality with particularly the living spaces or things that might be interpreted as being living spaces.
Yeah.
Maybe a naive question now, is this a happenstance of survival, that the material in Orkney is made of stone and it's just easier to find?
Oh, it's because they didn't have trees, or at least they got rid of they chopped down the tree, because the earliest Neolithic houses in Orkney are made of timber. But if you go there nowadays, there are very, very few trees. And in fact, if you go to Shetland, there's a list of the native trees in Shetland. They are so rare. So
Right.
that's why they had to build in stone after a while. Yeah, and that's why you get these phenomenally well preserved archaeological sites in Orkney and Shetland, where you might not get them elsewhere. But you've also touched on a really important point. At Ballinhatty, they also had this evidence for this so-called four-poster site with a circle, a timber circle around it, and a whole elaborate thing. Barry Hartwell has published about that, yeah? And what we find in Scotland is you get enclosures at Dunragit, at Ledketty, at Forteviot, which are slightly similar to that. And indeed at Ledketty, you've got a four-poster inside that. And these date to between about 2800 and 2500 BC. So clearly, and you don't tend to get those within Orkney. So this whole grooved ware phenomenon, people have tended to, again, to take a very big paintbrush and say, oh, well, therefore it unifies Britain. No, it doesn't. And they've even said that, you know, cattle and pigs were driven down from Scotland, possibly Orkney, as far as Darrington Walls. No, they weren't. That is just a misreading or an overreading of the isotopic data there. What you have to do is to say, okay, let's look at grooved ware pottery. Let's look at its overall currency, as I tried to do for Ireland in the George Ogan Festschrift way back in 2004, and say, okay, how does it change? And what are the contexts in which it's used? And these four-poster timber circles are incredibly important, and I know a lot of them have been found in Ireland. And what I'd like to do is this comparative survey of the Scottish and Irish ones to see, are they contemporary and are they used in the same way? And very often you find that you get beaker pottery in there as a secondary deposit much later.
So that, and I think too, with some of the new discoveries around about the Newgrange area, again, potentially more of those four-poster type arrangements that have, so sites that haven't been interfered with before and have that opportunity, you know, for really getting in and hitting it with the full scientific arsenal that can be applied.
That's right.
Just Neil Jackman again, a few tentative dates for the tomb at the Hellfire Club in the Dublin Mountains. 3 dates so far, all within the 3800 to 3300 BC.
Right, that's good. And what are they on? Are they human remains?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe Neil could post in and say what he has from those.
Yeah.
Now, on the Spinning Hill Neolithic date, it came from James O'Driscoll and William O'Brien's recent publications in Hillfords.
That's right. Yes.
The sample was from the base of the ditch, but not certain if it was not certain if it was from the base of the ditch or a ground surface under the bank. So it's
right. Okay.
There's stuff from that time at that site. So yeah, that'll be worth seeing again.
Thank you.
And Rebecca Jones. Hi, Rebecca. Thanks, Alison. It's been a fascinating talk and looking forward to the RINS. And I think maybe at that point, just to ask a little question about the RINS lectures, you were saying they're going to be broadcast
That's right.
in the next couple of weeks, just leading up to Christmas. So where can you get access to this?
If you look at the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland website, just Google, it's Rind, R-H-I-N-D, Rind Sheridan, Society of Antiquaries Scotland, you'll find it. And I can't honestly remember, it's taken me 2 months to create these things, and I've filmed them all. And we're doing the post-production at the moment. I think they go out at 7 o'clock at night, every night from the 13th to the 18th. And you don't have to book, except on the 18th, we're going to have an hour-long Q&A session afterwards, where people can say, that was completely wrong, you know, or whatever you want to say, with a little tot of whiskey as well, which is great. Yes. not provided by the Society or anyone else, but yourselves. And so, yeah, and obviously I will just be discussing a lot of the things that I've mentioned here under Boyne to Brodgar, and you'll hear more about them, and you'll see some of the same slides, in fact.
Great. Well, that's, given the circumstances we all find ourselves in, we might all be able to get a chance to go and see at least some of those, Alison. That would be fantastic. A couple more. See. Oh, Liam McQuillan, colleague in Belfast, or well, near enough in Belfast. Thank you, Alison. Putting it out there, but like a long shot indeed. Has the project encountered any evidence anywhere for potential movement of human remains a long distance or short distance by sea? So rather than necessarily the remains that are buried being of the people who had lived there, but the remains that are being buried have been brought there.
That's a wonderful question, and it was something that I did wonder about when I was doing my PhD last millennium, and I was looking at the inclusions in pottery. And what was noticeable about a lot of Carraquil ware is that you might get, or some Carraquil ware, is you get marine shell in it in inland sites. And I do, and clearly, when you are burying somebody on the top of a mountain like at Carraquil, you're not likely to be living in the immediate vicinity all year round. I mean, I know there are these sites below that they might have been temporary occupation, but essentially, I think, you know, and part of the benefit of cremating people is that you can then put the remains in a bag and you can move them to where you want to bury them. But in terms of moving people across the sea, that's a very good question. Luckily now we are able to do isotopic analysis of cremated human bone, thanks to developments by Christoph Snoek. He used to be at the University of Oxford. He's now in Brussels. And so they can do, I think, strontium and oxygen isotope analysis. That's what they did to the cremated remains in the Aubrey holes at Stonehenge, and that's how they were able to say that people were carried there. Now, as with all isotopic analysis that looks at movement, it's much easier to say that somebody did not grow up in this local area. It's much easier to say that than to say, and that person came from there, in a particular place a long way away. And it's because you have to match it with the geochemical signature of different geological areas. Yeah, and if you have different areas that have got the same geology, then you might not be able to tell the difference between those two places. So I can say no, nobody has said that human remains were taken across the sea long distances, but it's a very nice idea, and it's something that people should be looking out for.
Just talking there about that change in the monumentality of some of the sites and the aggrandizement of it, and I know that the Boyne Brodgar project is focusing very much on Ireland, Isle of Man, and Scotland. Is there a connection with the development of the long barrows in Wessex and beyond, or is there is there a parallel to be drawn there, or is that the next project maybe?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, being an English person myself, I'd quite like to see more collaboration between Scotland and England. But hey, no, we're kind of going in the opposite direction. But never mind. But yes, I mean, you do get long barrows, and it's all part of this tradition that was introduced from the continent. And there are all sorts of open-ended questions that need to be resolved. So we know that people in Normandy, for example, were building long barrows 4,300 BC and before that. What we don't have is good dates for long barrows along northern France or Belgium that are closer in date to the ones that we've got. Yeah. So is it that the areas where they're most likely to have been are the areas which were really churned up during World War I and World War II, so they've destroyed them, or where there's less developer-funded archaeology, or where there's been so much industrialization that whole landscapes have been destroyed? We don't know. And likewise, those rectangular timber mortuary structures, I keep asking our French friends, driving them mad, have you got any of those in France? Have you been looking for them in France? Look for them, folks, because I think sooner or later they will find them. And it's a little bit like in northern Germany and Denmark, you get long barrows and you get rectangular timber mortuary structures. And some people have tried to say, like Bettina Schultz, that was the surname that I was trying to think of, that therefore there are links between Britain and Scandinavia. No, I don't think they were. I think they were cousinly links. And sooner or later, we're going to find on the continent the area where they were using, in northern France, rectangular timber structures, mortuary structures, and long mounds. But what we do find in England is having introduced that practice and that tradition, they then had their own trajectory of development. And this is something that Alistair Whittle has done fantastic work on. So the 7 Cotswold tombs, for example, that you get around Gloucestershire and around the, around the River Severn, are their own kind of monument. But actually there are elements of those monuments, like the intensive use of dry stone, that are echoed, say, at Audleystown. Yeah, there's really, really, really nice dry stone walling there. And likewise, there are some ceramic links, yeah, between Northern Ireland and, like north and south up the Irish Sea. So yes, these different areas are making their own twists. They're adopting and adapting these traditions and ceramic traditions as well, and they're interacting with each other. So it's a complicated story, but it's one that's well worth telling. And in exactly the same way, portal tombs are really, really interesting, because you get them in Wales, you get them in Cornwall, you get them in Ireland, you don't get them in Scotland. And you can see how they develop in their own ways in these different areas.
Super, thank you. You see, a note from Colin Perkins. Thank you again for a wonderful lecture and fascinating discussion. And noting that whenever we're in Edinburgh to visit the National Museum of Scotland and the Early Peoples exhibits, so you've got people booked up now already for your RINS lectures. So even better. Alison, I think we could probably talk on this for the rest of the night, and I know at some point we would love to see, what's going to happen next with the Boyne to Brodgar project experience, whatever way one might describe it. I wanted to ask just one question about the importance of the research frameworks that you're looking at, and the thematic approach that you've taken within the project. I suppose one part of it is how important is the research framework, and how adaptable is the research framework, I suppose is one question. But have you found that the research framework has allowed you to explore the various themes as they come up, or do you find it restrictive whenever you're trying to focus on an item which your attention can very easily go sideways?
That's right, yes. And I think that's, it's a really crucial question relating to all research frameworks. Are they restrictive or are they facilitative? And we're very keen that the Boyne to Brodgar one should be facilitative. And you can never control yes, you can. You can control what research people do by funding or not funding them. And Boyne to Brodgar is not all powerful. So while we can say to governments, look, these are the big questions that we think, need to be answered. So if you get people asking you for money on these themes, then it would be quite a nice thing if you could fund that. And also by meshing our research framework within all these other ones that exist, and including Scotland's archaeology strategy, which I should have mentioned, which is an excellent guide to the way things should go, not just in terms of research, but also in terms of community involvement and presentation and heritage tourism. Then yes, I think these things are they're more facilitative than restrictive. And also, it's like the proof of the pudding is whoever uses them. Yeah, and you'll find that people will do fantastic bits of research, or by sheer chance, say a developer funded excavation will throw up, oh my god, that site it dates to 4200, wow, and it'll take research down a particular thing. So I think we should always be open-minded and open-hearted. I mean, the key things are collaborative, cooperative, open, community-orientated, listening, and hands across the water type stuff. And if we can work within that kind of framework of collaboration, then the future is really, really bright. Especially at a time when so much is militating against that and making it very difficult. But I've found in creating the Rhind lectures, people have been unbelievably helpful, and it's like a microcosm of the whole of society. Thank you to everybody for giving me your images and letting me cite your information, all that kind of stuff. And that really is the model for going ahead. And I wish everybody who's been listening to this really well with their research, and may it flourish, and also it's only by discussing these things and arguing in a nice way. I love a ding dong fight. That's how we move forward. If we were all to agree and say, well, we've got it all sorted out, how boring would it be? Nearly as boring as Roman stuff, Becky.
I think you're absolutely right. You've taken us on a fantastic tour of these islands and beyond this evening, Alison. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. And now for the next little while, a little bit of buzzing about, right, hang on, you said that, and there'll be questions will emerge from this now later on. So I have to say, I very much look forward to seeing, where this project goes. and very much hope that the Discovery Programme can be part of that and both learn from it and maybe contribute to it in due course too. And yeah, well done. It's fantastic, and congratulations to everybody that's been involved with it. It's wonderful to see a project that has taken so many different aspects between the academic world, the community sector, the people who live on the doorsteps of these places, their stories and their involvement and their participation, and getting that opportunity to learn again with a lot of these sites. It's also hugely refreshing when everyone's dealing with development-led work, which is quite often simply adversarial. Although nobody necessarily means it to be, but it quite often ends up that way. But there's actually really lots of valid reasons why that work should be done and needs to continue to be done. And as you say, to have the friendly arguments and the constructive debate that comes behind it. So thank you very much for the presentation this evening. And thank you all for the questions and for the participation tonight. We had a really, really good participation level there, and we maintained the numbers of people through the door, so it was really, really good. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to wrap up now, just the last bit of for Discovery Programme looking into next year. We'll be looking forward to hopefully talking a little bit more about research frameworks and their role for archaeology in the world in general. And we'll be posting up some more information about that come early in the new year. So for the meantime, thank you all again for joining this evening. I hope you enjoy the Rind lectures when they come up. I'll certainly be booking my time in with whiskey and tow. And all being well, we'll be able to talk like this or talk in person next year. So thank you very much.
Thank you.